I wouldn't didn't know if it was put out or how that worked.
Sorry, can you repeat that question again? I was looking at something.
Oh, only I assume that y'all put out like pictures with lines on there so you can do your notes on them.
Yes,
And I
yes.
did not see what's today's or was it put out yet already?
No, I didn't get a chance to put it out. Yeah, I was finishing everything last night. So, but I'll try to get that all out to you be in the beginning of the week going forward. So I was just getting everything kind of sorted and figured out.
Okay.
Gary?
And this, oh, go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say that I printed up those pictures with the note lines, and the pictures are very small. You can't see what's going on.
Okay. I think I had it. How many slides per sheet? I can make them bigger.
3.
We did no, we did 3 slides per sheet.
Would it be easier if I made one slide per sheet? What if we do two?
I don't know.
Okay. I'll give it a shot and I'll send it out to you and you just let me know if that works or not. So I'm happy to do
Okay.
more. I just said three. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I get it, and it looked like it looks great on screen,
sure.
but away from the it doesn't.
Nope,
Yeah.
makes sense.
Um, now
Gary,
y'all
this,
was
oh, I'm sorry. This is Kay Bill, and you should be able to do at least 3 on a page. So I would check the size of your pictures before you
mm,
try to put this one on a page.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe make them a little bit bigger then. So maybe three isn't enough, but maybe it's too small. Yeah, I'll work on that.
Okay.
Hey, Garrett, uh,
Yes.
I had a question about some of the material that was covered. At some point, I had read or heard that very early queens or queens that are produced very early in the season or may not be as good a quality as queens that are produced a little bit later on in the season. And given the fact that you covered a lot of material about how drones affect queen quality, I'm just wondering if if that could potentially be due to having some sexually immature drones or drones that are not mature enough to have those really good mating um, uh, behaviors. How that if that could in fact be a large reason why very early queens may not be as good a quality and may have be as fertile or have early queen failure.
That's a really great question. And one thing we know with beekeepers or people that produce large amounts of queens that you probably are buying, they start like queen rearing really early on, and so a lot of them started raising queens like a couple days ago. They always start like right at February 15th, and so a lot of times that's not enough time for them to raise enough drones or even sexually mature drones for the queens to mate with. And so I do notice a lot more queen failures of queens that are purchased early on, especially in February and early parts of March. Because like I mentioned, the drones really need, 48 to 50 days. And so if you put drone comb into your colony to raise drones, you need to wait at least like a month and a half to almost 2 months to have enough drones for your queen to mate with. Now, queens are mating with drones around the area, but even your neighbors, like they won't be producing enough drones or even mature drones by, early February to early March. And so, if it's possible to get queens that are mated in March or April, that's probably your best bet. I mean, May or June would probably be the best because there's probably enough drones out in the area that the queen's gonna be mating with. But it also depends on the weather. So if the weather's really poor during the mating, that's gonna directly impact the queen. So if the queen's going out on these mating flights for 7 days and it's rainy and cold and windy for 70% of the days, it's going to directly impact the queens and her ability to mate with more drones. And so I've seen those situations where the queen only mates with 6 drones, where she could be mating with 15 to 20 drones. So there's so much that goes into it, like the drones available, but also the weather conditions. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I think I'll go through the Q&A, and then we finish the final section. It won't be nearly as long. So I think these are sorted by, I'm gonna go to the earliest questions first. So it says just double checking this course fills a beekeeping 101 requirement. So yes, that's correct. And so everybody that's partaking in this 10-week course will be fulfilling that requirement, and we'll make sure that we have that all in the tracking module. Kim said, we have done hive inspections, but have never seen the queen. There's evidence the queen is there, just no eyes on her. We've gotten books, but how do we see the queens better? Yeah, so for me, I think this comes with more experience. Sometimes it can be hard to find the queen. If you see signs of an egg, if you see, young developing larva, that means that there is an active laying queen in the colony. But this comes with more and more time. Now, one issue you could be having is you're maybe over smoking. And so if you smoke the colonies too much, then that could cause the workers and the queens to disperse. And so it's really not important. It's really important to not over smoke, but yeah, maybe try to find different ways to look for the queen. It's going to take more time and more experience. It also depends on the color of the colony. So Heather had a question from Dwayne. So after the nurse bee stage, does the hypopharyngeal gland become inactive, or do they just not use anymore? Yeah, so all bees have a hypopharyngeal gland like workers, but it gets a lot smaller and I guess more shriveled up. And so in a situation, let's say that a forager there's foragers in the colony and all the nurses were taken away, those foragers can revert back to nurses because they need more nurses in the colony. In that situation, they'll kind of grow those hypopharyngeal glands again. And so, but typically after they reach that nurse stage, they become shriveled up and unused after that. But they're still there, and they can still be used in situations where they may need to revert back to a nurse. A question from Billy. So how far do queens and drones travel to DCA bars? That's a really good question. I think we're still learning more about that. I've seen a few studies, but I'm not entirely convinced by them. I think they did show that they can fly somewhere between 1 to 3 miles away. But I have seen queens and drones mate within one single yard, and so in some situations like that, that could happen. But typically, the queens and drones try to go different distances. So the drones might fly farther away versus the queens a shorter distance, but my goal research wise is to find these DCAs and try to figure out more about the distances that they're actually flying. Question for Russell. So do laying workers pose challenges to introducing a new cage queen? Yeah, potentially. So one thing when you have a laying worker colony, right, they've become what we like to call hopelessly queenless, where they've kind of given up hope on raising a new queen, and that can make it really difficult for introducing a queen into a new colony. And that could lead to a situation where they upsert the queen and kill the queen, even if you introduce a queen. And one reason for that is because a lot of the workers are older, they're more aggravated, and they're just kind of, I guess, mad at life. And so they're less willing to introduce a new queen. So there's different things you can do about laying worker colony. I know a lot of beekeepers just go out and shake the bees, um, you know, a distance away, and then reuse that comb. Some beekeepers do put that laying worker colony onto a strong colony, with like paper sheet on top, so they kind of combine the two, so it already has a queen in it. So if that strong colony has that laying worker colony on top, it might take in the laying workers and start it from scratch. But yeah, I wouldn't waste money on a brand new queen and introducing it to a laying worker colony. It's not worth it. I mean, I guess it could be a situation where they introduce, but I think your chances are very, very low. A question from Leah. How long can a colony survive without a queen? So a colony can survive for for a few months, I'd say. So I've seen situations where a colony loses a queen, unable to raise a queen and become a laying worker, and they can survive like that for, a couple months, but you'll start seeing a lot more drones in the colony because there won't be any new workers. Those workers will start getting older, eventually dying off, and so they start declining really quickly. And so they won't survive too much longer, but I've seen them survive for a couple months past that. But the problem is if you leave it too long, it ruins all your comb because they start changing all that worker comb to drone comb, and that can ruin all your comb. So you really might catch it early before it becomes an issue. Question from Ruby. Does the DCA sites change from year to year? So There's some reports of DCAs that were found 40 to 50 years ago that are the same DCA sites that we have now. And so I'd say, and we're still learning more about this, the DCAs are typically the same year in, year out. But there could be new DCAs formed. We just don't know much about DCAs. Most beekeepers have never seen a DCA, so we need to do a bit more study on that. But there are some DCAs that were found a long time ago that are still DCAs now. Question from Josh. Does Jones sperm mix in this queen spermatheca? I've always been told that if a hive's temperature changes suddenly, it could be that she has moved from one drone sperm to another, and that she fully uses one drone's genetics contribution before moving to the next. So the queen actually does a really great job of mixing the sperm and the spermatheca. You could have situations where they may be laying workers from just one drone versus another one, but in most cases, what we see is that the queen mixes the sperm really well, and she lays a lot of different works from a lot of different drones. So we're still learning more about that, but I'd say that the queen, from what I've read, mixes the sperm really well in the spermatheca. Okay, question from Andrea. So how many times does the queen mate during her mating flight? So queens may go on multiple mating flights. So typically for maybe 5 to 7 days, she'll go on multiple mating flights. Sometimes she may only mate once, but she does mate with somewhere between 15 to 20 males on these multiple mating flights. Sometimes she can mate with them all in one flight, but typically it occurs over a multiple day period. Question from Dwayne. With the open breeding of queens and drones, how long do these selected traits tend to last? Is it greatly variable from generation to generation, or does it increase or decrease over time? Now this is tough because most beekeepers have an open breeding program. So what that means is you're not collecting drone semen and directly inseminating the queens. So you really don't know which drones your queens are mating with. So if you're buying a queen that has one specific trait, then you don't know really the next generation, the daughters from that queen, you don't know which drone she's mating with. So if you have one trait, you can decrease that trait by 50% after each generation. So you can lose that really quickly. But it really depends on the drones in your area. So if you're in a really isolated area and you know that your drones that you're selecting are in that area, or if you're kind of flooding that area with your drones with known genetics, you can make that trait last longer periods of time. But the best way is to really do closed breeding program and insemination, so you know exactly which queens the drones are inseminated with. And so that's one issue with purchasing queens. Some beekeepers may purchase queens that are close mated and part of a selected breeding program, but once you buy those queens and you start open mating them, they can lose those genetics and then they can lose those traits really quickly. Okay, question from Kay. What do you think about dusting bees with powdered sugar for mite control? The mite biting made me think of this method, and I've heard of it before. Yeah, so I've seen a few studies using dusting, and what that means is you get some powdered sugar and you pour it on top of the colony, and that increases the grooming of the bees, and it could be increase the grooming for the mites. I think with powdered sugar, the way it really combats mites is the bees try to shake out that sugar, so they tend to shake out the mites. It could potentially increase grooming, but I haven't seen any studies that show it increase grooming. Now, I would say with like dust with powdered sugar, it may be a way to control mite levels to some extent, but there's a lot of different options that are more effective. So I wouldn't rely on, dusting with powdered sugar. It may kill a few mites, but not enough to keep them at bay. Question from Harold. So how long after the pin test to come back and access? Yep, so 1 day. So Harold, yeah. So if you do the pin test and you kill the brood, you come back 1 day. So 1 day tells you more than enough information about how hygienic the colony is and how they're able to remove any of that dead brood. And then Susan had a question. So which lines have VSH? So the major one is pole line, but I do know of a lot of beekeepers across the country that have started selecting for VSH. I know there's a few here in Texas that are actually selecting for rural sensitive hygienic behavior. And so I would ask them more about their selection program and whether they're selecting for VSH. But yeah, there's not too many beekeepers are practicing closed mating. So like the earlier question, things be open mated. So even if you're selecting for VSH, they could be the queen could be mated with drones that don't have that trait or don't have those genetics. And then last question. So David said, is it possible that washboarding is bees sharing pheromones to help the returning foragers? So one way that, and I'll talk about this during the next section, is one ways that the bees help orient new foragers to come back to the colony is through the nasanov pheromone, and this is a pheromone that's released to alert the rest of the bees. Now, washboarding could be a behavior where they're releasing nasanov, but there isn't any evidence that they're actually releasing that pheromone. It just seems like they're actually like scratching the side of the box, but that doesn't mean that they're sharing some sort of pheromone that's helping the bees. We're just learning more and more about it. Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to get into the final section. And if you have any more questions, just leave it. Well, I'll have Heather put in the Q&A just so we can keep track of all the questions. Okay, so the final section is honeybee physiology. And really what physiology means, physiology basically means what is the function of bees and their specific parts, right? So when we think about anatomy, right, these are the different structures of a bee, but physiology is how these all work together. And these functions are really important for every part of the bee to live, survive, to communicate, to excrete waste, to absorb nutrients. These are how all these different parts work together for a bee to function, survive, and grow and develop. And so, similar with humans, we have all these different physiological systems. And so here's a list of them, really all the different systems, right? We have a respiration system. So what that means is our ability to breathe and take in oxygen. Oxygen is a really important part of our cells and our cell metabolism and so on. The circulatory system, so that'd be like our blood system and our heart. That circulation system is really important for transporting nutrients across the bee, but also important for excreting waste and removing any waste that can be damaging to the bee. The digestive system, that's really important for taking in nectar and pollen and digesting it in a form that the bees can use to grow and help developing larvae. Excretion system, so the ability to separate the valuable nutrients from the waste, take that waste and excrete it, because as that waste builds up, that can be extremely damaging and toxic to the bees. The nervous system, this is the way that the bees communicate in a really quick way. So, with the nervous system, well, the circulation system takes a long time because that bee blood has to spread throughout the body. But the nervous system is one way for the bees to instantly react and communicate that to all the muscles and tissues within their body. And so, nervous system for humans, right? We use the brain and nerve systems to communicate that information, and bees have a very similar system. The sensory system, so we think about all the senses, so touch, feel, hear, see. Bees have all these different senses, and they use this to really view their outside environment, interpret the outside environment, and respond to that environment. We have the muscular system, so these are the muscles that allow the bee to move, fly, and navigate in the air. And so the biggest muscle is going to be the flight muscle that allows the bees to fly and forage, but even allow drones and queens to fly to these mating areas. The endocrine system, so like humans, bees have hormones. So the endocrine system just basically means hormones. And hormones is a way for basically the body to communicate throughout all these tissues in a wider way. So the nervous system is a very specific reaction, specifically reacting to specific tissues, whereas the endocrine system is sort of a hormone dosage that can really provide some kind of cue to all these different tissues. The exocrine system is basically these pheromones. So what glands and pheromones do bees have to not only communicate within the colony, but communicate throughout the colony? And then reproduction, so queen reproduction and drone reproduction, which I talked about, and insect immunity. So these are basically all these systems that work together for all these different functions, and that allows the bees to move, to behave, to feed, and to see the outside world. So respiration. So honeybees don't have lungs like humans or mammals. So, humans, right, we have lungs, and lungs, go in and out and allow us to intake oxygen and expel, CO2. But instead, honeybees have what we like to call small spiracles. So these spiracles are holes on their body. So there's about, 8 spiracles on each side of the body, and they're basically small holes. And these small holes have valves that allow the oxygen to get in and CO2 to release from the body. It also makes sure that the water isn't leaving the body so the bee doesn't dehydrate. And so, unlike lungs, honeybees have these small spiracles for intaking the air. But like humans, bees actively contract and release their whole abdomen. So if you actually watch a bee, you can see them kind of moving their abdomen in and out, kind of like a breathing like motion. And that allows them to take in air and oxygen and then release CO2. And then a tracheal system moves oxygen throughout the body. So if we think about humans, our blood is a way that oxygen is transported throughout the entire body. And so, for example, the arteries take in the oxygen, bring it all the way through the body into the cells. But for honeybees, they have a tracheal system that brings the oxygen right to the cells and right to the tissues. And so, what's different about the blood, I'll talk about this a little bit more, is the honeybee blood or hemolymph isn't transporting oxygen, unlike humans. And so what happens is these small spiracles, they have these valves. So they open and shut. So when a bee wants to take in oxygen, they open these valves and they basically compress their abdomen, and that allow that oxygen to flow into what we like to call tracheal tubes. These tracheal tubes are dispersed all throughout the body, and they go into these small organs called trachea. And these trachea are connected to the tissues and the cells. And so the oxygen is directly delivered from the outside to the cells and tissues. And for example, like if I mentioned humans, for example, our oxygen is transported throughout the blood into these cells or tissues. But for honeybees, it's transported directly to the cells and tissues through the tracheal tubes and then the tracheals. Okay, circulation. So this is honeybee blood. So honeybees don't have blood, but they have a blood-like substance called hemolymph. And so for honeybees, it's different color. It's not the same as human blood, where it's not that bright red color. It's kind of like a darker, kind of blackish, really, really dark red color. But we call it hemolymph because it has a different function. So instead of primarily transporting oxygen like in humans, the blood or hemolymph for bees is basically transporting nutrients and expelling any type of waste. Now, honeybees have what we like to call an open circulatory system. So humans and mammals have a closed circulatory system. So that means we have a heart, we have arteries, and we have veins that allow blood to be transported throughout the body to very specific areas. So these veins and these arteries are going to very specific parts of your body, whereas the honeybees have an open circulatory system. So that means instead of arteries or veins transporting blood specifically through tubes, this blood is basically released and douses all the tissues. And so the blood is basically all throughout the bee abdomen, and it basically dosages and spreads the blood to the system. And so it doesn't flow as freely, if it flows freely inside their body. But the primary role for the hemolymph or the bee blood is to, one, transport nutrients. So once it's digested, the nutrients go into the hemolymph and are spread to all the tissues that need it to grow and survive. They also expel waste. So it's carrying waste to be expelled from the bee body, because as these toxins build up, they can be extremely toxic and deadly to the body. So really the two major roles is to transport nutrients and expel any waste. So similar to a human, bees have a heart, but instead of the heart being kind of closer to the brain, the heart is in their abdomen. And so the heart is right here, and the goals of the heart is to pump the hemolymph forward. So it's pumping the hemolymph forward to the tube into the artery or the aorta. And the aorta, its goal is to provide the hemolymph, which includes the nutrients, to the brain. Because just like humans, our brain needs the blood and the nutrients in the blood to protect the brain and to provide nutrients for the function of the brain. So the heart is basically pumping the hemolymph forward into the aorta, into the blood. And then once it's there, it goes kind of back to the entire tissue. So the whole body cavity, the thorax and the abdomen is filled with this blood instead of through specific arteries and specific veins. And these diaphragms right here, these kind of move in and out. And that's one way that blood is kind of moved in the circular matter. So the heart is pumping it forward, and then the diaphragm is pumping it back into the circular matter. So his blood's kind of pumping in this very, very specific circular motion, but it leaves and it's dousing all the tissues right here. So as I'll talk about with the abdomen, this is filled with a reproductive tissue, it's filled with digestive tissue, the stomach and everything, and the blood is basically dousing all those tissues. The hemolymph is primarily made up of water, salt, proteins, nutrients, and immune cells. But like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't contain any of the oxygen. So it's really similar to humans, but it doesn't transport the oxygen. Okay, digestion. So, just like humans and mammals, honeybees have, guts and digestive systems. And the goal of this is when food is kind of brought into the body, whether that's pollen or, nectar, the goal is to digest that in a way that the bees can really use. And so that takes these really complex nutrients and breaks it down into smaller nutrients that the bees can use and their tissues and cells can use. So, honeybees have really three major sections of their gut. They have the foregut, which is where the honey crop is and the honey is initially stored. The midgut is basically where the food is broken down into smaller nutrients that the bee can use. And the hindgut is where that is actually expelled. And so you can kind of view maybe the foregut as maybe your esophagus, right? So the food that initially goes into your body. The midgut is kind of like the stomach, the equivalent to the human stomach, and the hindgut is equivalent to the intestines, where it's kind of breaking down the material even more and then digesting any waste. But each one has this very specific role, from digestion to nutrient absorption and waste removal. So with a worker, so workers have these honey crops, and so when they fly out to a flower and collect nectar, they temporarily store it into this honey crop, and this is known as the honey stomach. And there's actually a valve right here called the proventriculus, and this acts as a filter or a valve. And so when the bees are coming back from the colony, they store the nectar in this honey crop, and then when they get back, they either transfer it to other workers or they regurgitate it into the cell to make into honey. And so once they take in honey from the flowers, they never get past this foregut. They just stay in this honey crop. And so if you're collecting, workers that are coming right back from the field and you squeeze them, like you squeeze their bodies, they'll kind of regurgitate that nectar because it's stored in this honey crop. And that's a lot of times you might see nectar kind of on their mouths because it's temporarily stored there. But yeah, but this proventriculus is really what's controlling what's being digested by the individual bee and what's going to be regurgitated into honey and other sources for the bee. Then we have the ventriculus, which is basically the midgut. So that's basically the equivalent of the human gut or the human stomach. And this contains a bunch of enzymes. And so enzymes are basically proteins that can break down the sugars into simpler sugars or break down the pollen into amino acids. And so the goal of the stomach is very similar to a human, where it breaks this down into nutrients that can be absorbed into the hemolymph or the bee equivalent of blood. The hindgut, this is in charge of basically removing waste. And so once these nutrients are broken down and absorbed into the blood, anything that the bees can't use or anything that is toxic to the bees goes through the digestive system and is removed through the rectum, so similar to the intestines. But bees also have something similar to kidneys, and they're called Malpighian tubules. So these really small lines right here, those kind of act like kidneys, and they basically filter any waste from the hemolymph or the blood. And so the blood is basically, going over these Malpighian tubules, and Malpighian tubules are taking all those toxic materials and then expelling them from the bee. Okay, next we have the nervous system. So it's sort of the equivalent of the honeybee brain. So with the circulation system, right, that can take a really long time to communicate throughout the entire body because that circulate through the entire bee, and that can be kind of a delayed response. One way that bees respond really quickly is through the central nervous system, or really the nervous system. And so one way is through these electrical signals. So what's faster than, imagine if you have a pump, right? Pumping some kind of fluid or water through a pump can take longer. But if you have an electrical wire, that is an immediate response, and you can, turn on a light switch really quickly because there's electrical signal going through that. With the nervous system for honeybees is the exact same way. So one way they can communicate and respond really quickly is through these electrical signals that go through the nervous system. And so let's say a bee sees a predator, this activates the nervous system and provides an immediate response to activate the alarm pheromone. Or if the bees do the waggle dance. It's one way for the bees to quickly learn and get that information. But you kind of view it as more of an electrical signal rather than a solid pump that can take a little bit longer. Within the nervous system are these axons and dendrites. So these are long tubes right here that are carrying a very specific electrical signal. Once it gets to the end of the dendrite, it moves over, these chemicals that we know about, right? So serotonin and dopamine. What's happening is this electrical signal. So let's say you take some sort of medicine or have some kind of a really fun time. This electrical signal moves really quickly, and it moves this dopamine and serotonin across to the next nerve ending, and then moves along the electrical chain. So, honeybees are very similar in that way, in that they have nerve sendings signals, and it allows a really quick electrical response across the body. But they also have these things like dopamine and serotonin, just like humans. So what's interesting about honeybees is they don't have a centralized nervous system like honeybees, right? So, or humans. So, humans, we have a brain, and that's sort of the central part of our nervous system. Honeybees basically have small brains throughout the entire body, and they're in charge of different parts of their body. And so I don't know if you guys have ever, taken an insect and cut their head off, or something happened to the insect where their head was cut off and they're still moving. And the reason that they're still moving is because they have all these little brains spread throughout their entire body. Now, obviously, the main bee brain has a really important purpose and a really important function, but each part has their own brain that allows for movement, such as in the thorax, or brain in the abdomen that allow them to digest and do all these different functions. And so instead of being centralized in just the brain, it's spread throughout the entire body. So the whole nervous system for the honeybees is made up of the brain and then these small ganglion. So the ganglion are basically small brains throughout the body. And there's basically 7 of these small brains or ganglia, and they kind of act as mini processing centers. So the brain is a major processing center, and these ganglia are the mini processing centers throughout the body. So there's 2 in the thorax, and these 2 ganglia are in charge of movement, they're in charge of flight, they're in charge of any type of locomotion. And then there's 5 in the abdomen, and they're in charge of everything from digestion to circulation to immunity, and a lot of these different things. So yeah, you can kind of view it as it's not centralized like humans, but bees have these small brains throughout their body. This is what the brain actually looks like, and during my graduate studies, I dissected a lot of bee brains, and I got pretty good about it. It took a long time, but you can actually dissect the brain, take a look at it, and this is what it actually looks like. And so there's really 3 major parts of the brain. And so the protocerebrum, this is involved with processing vision and controls the mushroom bodies. Now, honeybees have mushroom bodies, and that allows them to learn and take in new information, like learn about flower sources, learn about the waggle dance, learn about the queen state, everything. So all the learning is happening in this very small portion of the brain called the protocerebrum. The deuterocerebrum is basically in charge of the antenna. So as I mentioned, the antenna is really important for, pheromones, it's important for touch, it's important for hearing vibrational signals. The antenna is one of the most important parts, and that's controlled directly by the deuterocerebrum. And the tritocerebrum is in the back behind the deuterocerebrum, and this is in charge of the rest of the nervous system. So basically this connects the brain to all the little ganglia or the other processing centers. And then the eyes are here, so the optic lobes. So these are in charge with the vision and seeing the outside area. But there's really 3 major parts of the brain. Okay, so the sensory system. So just like humans, right? Bees have 5 different senses, but the way they sense it is different from humans. So just the way we sense something, such as what we see, what we hear, what we feel. Bees have those same senses, but they sense things a little differently, and they see the world a little differently. But when we think about the senses, right, their vision, their smell, their touch, their hearing, and their taste, they have all these different senses that allow them to navigate through a colony and outside the environment. So the first is vision. So honeybees, first off, have these 2 large compound eyes. And these compound eyes have about 5,000 to 6,000 tiny lenses. And so instead of having one eye that sees all in one viewpoint, the bees produce basically all these small pictures and put them all together into one. And so if you look more closely into the compound eyes, there'll be a lot of these different lenses, and they're taking little snippets of what they're seeing, and they put that all together into one vision. And so these compound eyes not only allow them to see kind of a wider range than what we can, because they kind of have more of a 360 view, but allow them to pick up more precise vision of outside area. On the top, they have these three simple eyes called ocelli. They are really important for sensing light intensity and UV light. So, like I mentioned, one way that bees navigate through the air is through UV, and this UV is detected through the ocelli. So, one way that bees can detect where flowers are and find their way back and navigate is by looking at the UV light from the sun and navigating based on that light. So, these ocelli are extremely important for navigating and communicating sources to other bees. So, what do bees actually see? So just like humans, honeybees are trichromatic. So that means they have really three color receptors or photoreceptors. So like humans, bees can only see three major types of colors, and they really fill in the rest. But for honeybees, they can't see these longer wavelengths. So they can't see these longer wavelengths like red. What they can see is the shorter wavelengths. So shorter ones include this green color, this blue color, and UV. So humans, we can see, blue, green, and red, but bees can see UV, blue, and green. So a lot of what bees are seeing is through this UV or ultraviolet short-wave light, and this is something that we can't see. And so we think about what bees can see and what they can't see. It's really important to know that they see UV, and it's something that we can interpret or see as humans. And this is basically what a bee sees. So these are this is basically one flower. So this is a kind of a yellowish flower that a human can see. And this is how the bees kind of view that flower. So if the bees are somewhere between 7 to 10 centimeters away from that flower, this is what they basically see. So each of those small lenses on their eyes are picking up a small image, and that's making kind of a rough, kind of hard to see image. But then as the bees get closer, that image fills up. But as you can see, because bees have different photoreceptors, the color of that flower is different from what humans see. So, for example, the humans are seeing maybe a yellowish color, but the bees are seeing this purplish color. And it really depends how close the bees are or how far away the bees are. Another example is kind of this white flower that we may see as humans, and this is what it looks like from a bee from a distance. So, like I said, they had all these different lenses and try to make up a blurry vision of that flower. But as they get closer to the flower, it gets more and more clear and more concrete of what that is. And one thing that we're learning more about is how bees detect flowers. And so, like I mentioned, bees can see UV light, and some of these flowers can emit UV that we can't see, but bees can see. And if you actually put like some flowers under UV light, you can see maybe what bees could potentially see when they go to these different flower sources. And so UV is a really important way that flowers can attract bees to certain areas. And so some of these flowers has very specific colors and very specific UV light wavelengths that allow bees to find flowers and go to the flowers. And so it's one way that bees and flowers kind of work together, where the flowers are producing very specific signals to alert the bees, but then the bees are providing pollination services to the flowers. And we'll talk about this a bit more during the bee plant and pollination section, but it's just really important to know that what we see is different than what a bee actually sees. Smell. So bees typically smell with their antenna. So if you look at this picture, bees have two antennae. They're quite a bit longer, and they use them to move them back and forth. And what this antenna does is, in one, detects scents or pheromones. It allows them to find food. So if they're in a flower, they use this antenna to kind of move around and find food. It's kind of like a cane to find where the actual flower source is and where the pollen and nectar is in the flowers. It's also used to recognize other hive workers. So, workers within a colony have a very specific pheromone, and so it's used to make sure that those nestmates are actually from that colony. Because if there's workers from other colonies robbing that colony or getting into that colony, they can detect that with a cue and then push them outside the colony. Then finally, antenna is really important for communication. So basically it's this antenna is full of a bunch of nerve endings or sensilla, and it allows them to detect basically chemicals in the air or pheromones in the air. Now, drones have a ton of these sensilla or these nerve endings. They have about 30,000 compared to only 5,000 for workers and 2 to 3,000 for queens. Now, one reason that drones have so many is because they're using these cues to find queens, locate queens, and mate with queens, and also find these DCA areas. But yeah, this all say that antennas are really important for a lot of different reasons within the colony, but specifically looking at sense and identifying that signal, what that scent is. And this is a really good picture. So these are two nestmates, sharing food with each other and communicating with each other. And so if you look into a colony, you'll see a lot of bees constantly feeding and working with each other. So right now, they're actually spreading food between each other, but they're actually submitting a signal between the two bees. But you can see the antenna kind of moving back and forth. They're kind of moving back and forth, sharing a pheromone and saying, "Hey, you're my nestmate, and I need to take care of you, and I need to keep you inside the colony." If this was a foreign worker from a different colony, they may use that antenna to say, okay, you're not from this colony, so let's kick you out and kill you. Okay, next is taste. So honeybees don't have taste buds. So even though they have these long tongues, and we like to call them proboscis, and they're not really tongues, like I said, kind of tongues. They're more like a straw. But they can also kind of lap up that nectar once it's inside the flower. And so we like to call this the proboscis. But the proboscis doesn't have taste buds, but instead they have what we call peg organs. And these peg organs are found not only in their mouth, but it's also found in the antenna in their feet. So bees can basically taste, pollen and nectar through their feet, through their mouth, and also through their antenna. So that's one way for them to assess the food, the quality of food, and then uptake those nutrients into their body. And like I said, the bees also use mouthpaste to taste nectar and determine sugar concentration. So when bees are going out to the flowers, um, they basically test the sugar and see what concentration of sugar actually is. Because the higher the sugar concentration, the more desirable it is for a colony. And so they can gauge it by tasting the nectar and determining the sugar content. One way they also taste, so this is the proboscis. This looks like, if it's a lot closer, it's basically a tongue or basically a straw where they suck it up, but then they use this kind of small like tongue-like structure to move the food in to the organ called the honey crop. But they also have these mandibles right here. And I view mandibles as small arms on their heads. And so these mandibles are used for moving things around, for molding wax. It's basically the hands for the entire bees, but it allows them to break down pollen, for example, into smaller grains that they can actually feed on and ingest. And so the taste is really determined by, proboscis, but also some of their mandibles. Okay, so for touch, so honeybees have hair-like structures across their body, and these hair-like structures, when they're bent, they activate a signal. So one way that bees can sense touch is through these hairs, and once those hairs bend, that activates a nerve ending and provides a signal to the bees. Now, touch is really important for the antenna and the legs, and so one reason that bees maybe respond if you're touching them is because those signals are moving, and that allows them to fly and potentially chase after you or chase after something else. But touch is really important for the antenna and the legs. Okay, so bees don't hear like humans. So, if you look at a honeybee, they don't have ears. And so that's not how they actually hear the outside. But what they do is they detect vibrational signals. And so there's been a lot of new devices that have been developed that detect vibrational signals within the colony. And that can tell you a lot about how healthy the colony is, how much honey they're producing, and whether those colonies are about to crash. And so they produce a very specific vibrational signals, and that's how they sense signals from the outside environment. Now, these vibrational signals are detected through sensory organs in both their legs and their antenna. On their legs, they have subgenual organ, and they sense vibrational signals from the ground. So if they're sitting on the ground or sitting on the bottom board, they can sense any vibrational signals coming to their colony. So if something's walking towards their colony, or a bear's walking to the colony, or something's coming from the ground, the legs are typically sensing these vibrational signals and sending some sort of alert to the rest of the colony. And the Antenna, the Johnston's organ detects vibrational signals in the antenna. So antenna are really important for determining those sound waves and those vibrations and sending signals throughout the rest of the colony. Okay, then finally the muscle system, so flight and movement. So, just like humans, honeybee mussels have these striated muscle fibers. So the muscles really aren't that different from honeybees versus humans. The biggest muscles are actually found in the flight muscles in the thorax, so right around here. So that's where the biggest muscles are because that's what's moving the legs. That's also what's moving the wings to fly long distances. I mean, there's muscles throughout the body, right? Muscles in the digestive system, muscles in the stingers, and so on. But these big muscles in the wings or in the thorax allow them to fly somewhere between 200 beats per second. So it allows them to basically move these large bodies out the ground, move 15 to 20 miles per hour, and go to flower sources or abscond or swarm away. So these flight muscles are really important for not only for the workers, but also for the drones and queens to fly and move. Okay, the endocrine system, that basically means the hormones. So the major hormone is juvenile hormone, and that's really what determines a queen versus a worker. So when those queen cells are enlarged, so let's say you have a larval to instar. When they change that larval instar to a queen development, then they receive more food in the larger queen cells. And what happens is it increases this hormone called juvenile hormone. And as its hormone increases, that allows the queen to get bigger. That allows the queen to have ovaries and reproductive tissue, and that allows the queen to really become a queen. Whereas for a worker, the juvenile hormone is restricted. So the reason that a queen becomes a queen and a worker becomes a worker is because of these juvenile hormone levels. But also, juvenile hormone is really important for workers. So as they get older, these juvenile hormones in workers get get higher and higher and higher, and that tells the workers to move from one task to the next. And so, really young workers have low juvenile hormone levels, and that determines that they're going to be the housekeepers, determine that they're going to be the nurse bees. But then as they get older, the levels increase and they start doing those older tasks. And so the foragers have the highest juvenile hormone levels, and that's really determining that these workers are going to fly out and collect nutrients and resources for the colony. Okay, so honeybees have a lot of glands and pheromones, and so I'm not going to talk about all of these, but here's several lists, and so they are in the reading material. But really, these top two, the hypopharyngeal, mandibular, these are produced by the workers and typically involved with brood food. Mandibular gland can be important for queens also for pheromones like the Q and P pheromone. The nasional gland is what bees use to help bees navigate back to the colony. So they stick their butts in the air in the front of the colony, and this tells the bees about where their colony is. So this nasional is really important for navigation and orienting workers. Wax production. So some bees produce wax in their glands when they become construction workers, and their only role is to produce wax and lipids for wax production. We have venom glands for producing venom. We have a gland to produce alarm pheromone, the pterygoid glands for queen recognition, and Duffer's gland. But this all to say that there's a lot of glands with bees, and they're used for communication and producing substances within the colony. So here are the three types of glands. We have wax glands. So if you ever see a bee that has kind of these white or yellowish markers on their abdomen, this is them excreting the wax. So they make these small crystals, and then they use those mandibles or hands on their head to manipulate the wax and put it into a colony. And so when your colony start producing wax, you might see a few workers with these wax crystals on the bottom of their abdomen. The hypopharyngeal mandibular gland are found in the nurse's head. And so first I had a question about what they look like for bees that aren't nurses. This is what a nurse bee's hypopharyngeal gland actually looks like. It's right around the brain. It's in charge of making the brood food for the workers. But as they get older and they have no need to nurse or produce brood food, it becomes shriveled up and looks more like this. But in a situation where there needs to be more nurse in the colony and older forager needs to revert back to a nurse, these will grow again and then be similar to this hypopharyngeal gland. So, this gland will change as the bees get older, but it's definitely large with a nursing bee. And then venom gland, I talked about this a little bit more, but these glands are used to not only produce venom during the sting, but also produce alarm pheromones that alert the rest of the bees about predators or disturbances within the colony. So probably the most important pheromone is the queen mandibular pheromone. So this is produced by the queen, and it's important for a lot of different reasons. So the most important part is colony communication. So this queen pheromone is produced by the queen and spread by the workers throughout the entire colony. So that alerts the rest of the workers that there's an active laying queen in the colony. She's high quality, and they don't have to worry about replacing that queen and raising a new queen. It also modulates worker behavior. So queens produce very specific queen pheromone that tells the workers they need to go out and forage for more protein and resources to support egg laying. So as the queen starts ramping up egg laying and brood production, this pheromone will tell the workers to collect more resources. It's important for drone attraction. So, during these mating areas, the queen will produce this pheromone, and that attracts drones to go to the queen and mate with the queen. Similar with the communication, it's important for colony cohesion. So basically, the colony knows the queen, and they need to work together as a colony. If something happens to the queen, it could be anarchy. um, I'm not sure that's the right term for it, but it's kind of anarchy where they're kind of frantically trying to raise a new queen and bring that colony back together so they can focus more on getting those resources and supporting growth and survival of the colony. And then finally, yeah, it's important for queen rearing control. So once that queen mandibular pheromone or QMP starts to dip, that tells the workers they need to produce a new queen and replace that old queen. But also, yeah, if the queen dies suddenly, they'll tell them to raise a new queen, um, and so on. So this is a national pheromone. So once you start getting colonies, or if you have colonies already, you'll see a bunch of bees in the front with their kind of butts sticking up, and you'll see kind of this opening right here. And this is where the national pheromone is being released. And this national pheromone is basically, I guess you can kind of view them as the flag people at an airport. They're kind of flagging the planes come in, or you can use as the radio control tower. They're basically telling the planes to come into this very specific area. For honeybees, they use this pheromone as sort of a signal to tell the workers to come back and fly back onto where their colony is. And so it's extremely important for colony orientation. So it one helps the bees locate their hive entrance, but two, it's important for swarm clustering sites. So once a bee swarms and goes to a tree, it helps all the bees orient to that one tree branch to find a more permanent home. It's also important for foraging coordination, so guides workers to food and water sources, and it's also used as a swarm attraction. Duffer's gland. So this is one produced by the queen. It's in charge of egg marking. So every time a queen lays an egg, she basically marks it with a very specific pheromone, and that's a really important cue for basically the workers to know that there's more eggs and more brood in the colony, and they need more resources to support that brood production. It's important for colony recognition, so nestmate identification. So they had that cue when they first laid, and so the workers know that worker is from that colony, and they should be accepted into the colony. So it's extremely important for recognition. And then finally has differences between workers and queens. In queens, it does support reproduction and ovary development and egg laying, but for workers, it's more important for antimicrobial properties. And then the tergite gland. So this is produced the brood pheromone. And if you go to any brood or a bee supply store, you can buy this brood pheromone. And if you put into the colony, the goal is for that pheromone to be used and really initiate egg laying and initiate workers to focus on brood production. But this is typically released inside these segments. And its role is to alert the bees that there's brood in the colony, but it also suppresses mite reproduction. And so as that brood starts to go down, and as really the queen is gone, then the worker reproduction will start. They start developing ovaries and become a laying worker colony. And so one way to combat laying worker colonies is to put more brood back in the colony. So by putting more brood, that suppresses worker reproduction and represses laying workers. Now, let's say if you do have laying workers already, it's not going to suppress that, but it can be a way to give you more time before you get a new queen and before that colony becomes a laying worker. And then we talked a lot about reproduction, so I won't go too much detail, but the reproduction system is different between queens, workers, and drones. So queens are in charge with storing sperm, but then laying 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day. The drone's role is to produce sperm and then fly out and mate with unmated queens. And the worker's role is non-reproductive, so they don't have much of a reproductive system. But in some cases, workers could become laying workers and start and begin to lay unfertilized eggs. And then final end on the immune system. So, honeybees don't have an adaptive immune system. So they don't have antibodies and they don't have a way of really learning about diseases and infections the same way humans does. But one way they combat that, especially when you have so many bees living in a tight cluster, is one, through social immunity. So I talked about grooming and hygienic behavior. Two is an innate immune system. So they have all these proteins called hemocytes throughout their hemolymph, and they're used to basically find a bacterial pathogen and cover them up so that infection can't damage any cells or tissues. Once that infection is covered up, it's excreted through the waste system and from the bee's body. And so humans have, these proteins similar to what a bees have, but that's the only immune system that bees really have. But one way that we're learning that bees have an adaptive immune system is through vitellogenin. And we'll talk about vitellogenin a lot more. But if there's a pathogen inside the blood or the hemolymph, or if there's an infection inside the hemolymph, that can actually bind to the vitellogenin, and it acts as sort of antibiotic for bees. So it can learn about diseases and help the bees be more prepared for that disease. And so let's say there's a bacterial infection that binds to vitellogenin, it can make a concerted effort for all these proteins to attack the disease and keep it down. So this is one way that bees, even though they don't have the same immune system as us, can learn and combat some of these infections. So there's been a lot of talk about the new honeybee vaccine, and the way the honeybee vaccine is through this vitellogenin protein. So if you expose a queen to a bacteria, or if you expose a queen to a virus, they can pass that vitellogenin to their eggs, and the eggs will be primed and ready to fight out that infection. And so there was a new vaccine to start a bacterial infection, and I think it has a lot of potential. But basically, what happens is a queen is exposed to a bacteria, a fungal pathogen, or any type of disease. It binds to this vitellogenin protein, so it dies, but then binds to the vitellogenin protein, similar to an antibody, and then that's passed on to the eggs. And so when the eggs emerge as a larva and into adult, they have this vitellogenin with the dead bacteria or the pathogen, and they're able to fight out the disease or infection right afterwards. And so we're learning more about this new type of immune system. We've always thought they've only had an innate immune system, but we're learning that vitellogenin could be a really great way for bees to learn about infection and combat an infection. Okay, so next week we will have Molly Keck talking about getting started beekeeping. So I know the last two sessions, there was a lot of information about biology, behavior, and physiology. But next week we'll get started into what you need to get started in beekeeping. So that includes beekeeping equipment. We talk about nooks and packages, requeening, everything you need to know to get started. And I only have 5 minutes, so maybe there's a few questions I can answer quickly, but just let me know. But in the meantime, before I look at some of the questions, I think Heather might respond. I'll have this recording available immediately after the session. So if you want to go back and watch the recording, you can do so. All the reading materials on the Google Classroom, but if you don't have access to that, let me know. We'll also have a community notes section. So we'd have notes and information for all the beekeepers. And then finally, we will have a quiz after this one. It won't be graded, just kind of gauge your knowledge and find ways that I can improve as a teacher. So feel free to drop off. I'm going to go through some of these questions to see what's here. Okay, so Kim said the reading material from 5th says that drones have 500,000 sensilla, but now it's 30,000. I'm confused. Which is it? Yeah. So it's 30,000 sensilla, so specific nerves. 500,000 is I guess a different type of nerve. So I need to change that a little bit more, but I'll just focus on the 30,000. Susan Mackenzie says, well, I'll go the first question. So will the April-May survey for honeybee losses include sampling? If so, how do I store prepare samples of a recently lost colony? I have John Cone, Queen Workers. Yeah, so this survey is more disturbing beekeepers. If you are curious about why your colonies died, you want them for more testing, you can just let me know. Susan, if you want to send your queen, I can take a look at your queen and see if she had any issues. But this is more just a gauge on the extent of colony losses and try to figure out what beekeepers are doing and what we can do to improve. And then Susan said, will I be able to use a drawn comb and resource from the failed colony for a new package? Do a freeze? Yeah, so it kind of depends. I saw your pictures and it didn't seem like there's any pesticide related kills, so you should be fine using that old comb. What I try to do and I recommend to beekeepers is to try to replace that comb every 5 years. So maybe replace 2 frames each year just so you have new comb in your colony. And so the problem with comb is it attracts everything. So it attracts pesticides, viruses, everything into it. So for me, I think it's good practice to replace that comb every 5 years if possible. Okay, perfect. Well, if there's not any questions, you have my email address, so feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be sending some emails afterwards to give you more information about the recordings and the reading material. But I hope you guys learned a lot today. But if there's anything you think I could improve on, just please let me know. Thank you, and see you next week.